afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Police and Crime Commissioner panel, Monday, the 25th of October, 2 p.m. Welcome, everyone. We are webcasting today, so if you could all be mindful of that, please, throughout the proceedings. We've all had copies of the agenda. I'll start at item 1. Any apologies, please?
I've received apologies from Councillors Hudson and Holmes.
Thank you. Item 2. Are there any declarations of interest? No. Item 3. The minutes of the meeting held on the 23rd of September and the 12th of October. Can I have agreement to sign those minutes off, please? Thank you. Item 4, decisions published by the Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner.
There are none on the Commissioner's website, Chair.
Thank you. Questions to the Commissioner from members of the public. I think we're mindful. Let me ask, Mandy, would you like to speak to that for me?
We have had some questions to the panel. The questioner, Mr. Dodd, isn't attending the meeting today, but will be watching on webcast. And the panel has formulated a response which is before panel for ratification today.
Thank you. I think we do acknowledge the questions that have been received. And the response, my letter lays out our current position and agreed way ahead. Are there any comments on that? Can we accept that? Thank you. Have been issued that. Yeah. That letter's been issued. Thank you. Thank you. Item 6, implementation of the reforms to the police misconduct and complaints regulations. Commissioner, have you anything to say on that one?
Excuse me, Chairman. Sorry, Chairman, you caught me at a slight disadvantage there. So we've got a report from my colleague who leads on the complaints, and this essentially is seeking to bring everybody up to date in where we are in terms of the new regulations and the option that the Commissioner's Office took, which essentially gives the Commissioner's Office oversight or an opportunity to consider when complaints go to appeal. And we also directly are engaged when there are complaints about the Chief Constable. In my view, we're in the right place with all of that. I cannot find the paper, but here we are. Thank you. Chair, perhaps best if anybody's got questions, I'll be happy to take them.
Okay. Are there any questions from members on that item? No? Okay then, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. Item 7 on the agenda then is the Police and Crime Commissioner's plan regarding police.
Thank you, Chairman. there's only a few key elements to Police and Crime Commissioner or a Fire Commissioner being able to set a strategic direction. And one of the key ones is around the appointment of chiefs, which the panel very comprehensively had a chance to meet the new Chief Fire Officer, Chief Constable at the last meeting. That's significant for the operational delivery of both services, which the Commissioner stays distant from, although has expectations of. And the second fundamental area of influence, if you like, on behalf of the public is through these plans, where I've sought very carefully to try and set out a balance between what we absolutely need these services to do in terms of protecting vulnerable people, dealing with those who are violent or likely to cause concerns, distress to the public, their core functions really, and the expectations that I believe the public have of those services. And I think it is a balance, because we're looking for really high quality expert responses where there's violence, exploitation, sexual offences. More recently, completely understandable focus on violence against women and girls, and things which can affect the whole community, like public protests and how they're managed. So we're looking for a service that can really deliver and act in the public interest there. These are areas where individuals can't do anything. They need the support of a trained, warranted service and all the experts that work alongside them. It's not just officers with warrants. It's people with community experience, staff with expertise. On the other hand, the public has an expectation that the things that matter to them receive a good response. Things that matter to them are taken seriously. And I think members will see that, particularly in priority 1 of the plan, this is where I'm trying to strike that balance. It's been very clear to me in the last 2 years in particular, but for longer than that, that the public are not always having their expectations met in terms of a response to their inquiries, their desire to share intelligence, to share their concerns about the community and individuals, and that manifests itself in slow response to phone calls, sometimes a slow response to communication digitally, dissatisfaction with feedback about how their cases or their concerns are being managed. So that's up front in priority 1, that we're going to be setting high expectations of a good, timely service when any member of the public or businesses wish to contact the police. Similarly, I've picked up that even in some cases where an individual will believe that they're the victim of an emergency, they're not seeing the service as quickly as they would expect to. And there are some key ways in which, some key choices that service can make as to just how highly they prioritise that. So it's this balance between the public expectation that everything that is absolutely essential is being done, but that also their concerns, their feeling of being heard, their feeling of being responded to is foremost in the service's mind. Antisocial behaviour, similarly. If any of us go and talk to our community members in village halls or knock on doors or just stop and chat in the high street, we're going to hear about concerns about antisocial behaviour. Now, antisocial behaviour isn't going away. It'll be here forever. But my concern is that where antisocial behaviour repeats, where we have the same problems over and over again, that the service plays its part in seeking to resolve that. And that's where a theme, really, from the plans, both plans, will come across to you, that the police service can't deal with many of these issues on its own. It needs the support of others in that community safety world, and some from beyond as well. Now, that might be councils, it might be housing associations, particularly in the case of antisocial behaviour. But it might also be other services like those looking after people with mental health concerns. So a joined up, real working relationship across Staffordshire is essential. If we can deal a little better, and in some cases a lot better, with our contact, our response times, our impatience with repeat incidents of antisocial behaviour, then I think we will see the confidence in our police service dramatically increasing, and I think we'll be close to being one of the best police services in the country again very soon. You'll also see that there's a reference in Priority 1 and Priority 2 around road safety. I've spoken briefly to the panel before about this. My deputy Helen and I are very determined that we deal, not so much deal, but that we do what we can, do what the partnership can, to reduce the amount of people who are killed or seriously injured on the roads. I think there were 24 people killed last year on Staffordshire's roads. That's 24 families, 24 communities who would be shattered by that. It's twice the number of people who were killed as a result of murder or domestic violence. It is a significant blight on society. And far too much of that is as a result of dangerous driving, drugs, drink, speed, and we're going to do what we can through the partnership to try and address that. There's another element to road policing as well, which is the highly effective policing of uninsured vehicles, MOTs, faulty vehicles. These add to the collision risk as well, but they also quite often lead the service to known offenders. And we'd like to see a continued commitment to that, not just with our roads policing unit, but also the shared work that we do with the West Midlands on our motorway network. So that's higher up there. And one of those things that we'll get if we're talking to community members is speeding. It's a big issue in villages and towns. And Helen and I are going to be talking to the Safer Roads Partnership about enhancing their capacity to encourage volunteers, more community speed watch. And it's one of the few but growing opportunities for members of the community to get involved and actively help the services address the problems that impact on their doorsteps. The other theme, I think, in the plan, and it differs from other places in this respect, it makes very clear reference to what we expect of the police service, but it also sets out that there's a wider issue here. Criminal justice has to work better. Our cases have to be brought to court more quickly, particularly concerns around rape and sexual assault. This is a national issue. Very few of those getting to court. When they get to court, it might take a year, might take 2 years at the moment for a case to be heard. And I think there's huge room for improvement, quite frankly, in our Crown Prosecution Service and our courts. We've got some very good relationships here in the county and across the region, but that crime bit of my role description, Police and Crime Commissioner, is about trying to move that world on. And I intend to take that very seriously, and you'll see some of that highlighted in Priority 5. A number of those partners that we deal with there, particularly probation, we've got very effective relationships with around another theme in the plans of early intervention and prevention. And this is really, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute no-brainer. If you can get in and resolve an issue before it escalates, then why wouldn't you? It's in the interest of everybody. Actually, it's in the interest quite often of the offender, because when people are not offered opportunities, not diverted, they can often find themselves deep in trouble, deep in a world that they can't get out of. So keeping people out of prison, working with young people when they're on the edge of criminality, working with probation when offenders leave prison, monitoring, managing them in the interest of society is one element of that, but also preventing them from offending again is another. And we've had issues, just quite the worst issues, haven't we, in our involvement with the chap who was released from prison and was involved in the atrocity down at Fishmongers Hall. So these things really matter. There's reference in here not only to not being able to manage these problems without our own local partners, but also addressing some of them, like that terrorism one, with regional partners. So we're very proudly a member of a regional team that deal with counter-terrorism, and also what we call the ROCU, which is the Organised Crime Unit, which we tackle in partnership with West Midlands, West Mercia and Warwickshire. And that gives us access to specialist skills, surveillance, covert techniques that as individual forces we couldn't have, but we need them to keep us all safe. So there's themes running through this. There's expectations of improved service, which I think mirror what the public expect and want to see. I hope so. Part of the fundamental about the consultation is that everybody gets an opportunity to tell me now, have I got that balance about right? Will this put us in a better place for the next 3 years? I think it will. I think if we can ask our service and partners to intervene sooner, respond quicker, take everybody's priorities and treat them as priorities, and balance that up with the great work they do day in, day out, looking after us, protecting us from harm. And I think with the leadership that we've got with our new Chief Constable and the existing service, we're going to end up in a pretty good place. I'm very happy to take some questions on that, Chairman, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner. An observation on your opening statement there. I think we're reassured that there was consistency. We shared the general outline of that at the last meeting. And we've noted that the consultation document is, of course, a draft at this stage. And it's comprehensive and targeted, which gives us some assurance, and it's also aiming to hear the voice of the community. That was one of your earlier statements 2 meetings ago. And we're also keen to see reference to how that unpacks around working with partners. And colleagues will be putting a few questions together around that. So also the fact that it's looking ahead, looking tomorrow, thinking ahead, thinking strategically is also reassuring. And we'll want to see how that unpacks as well, because there'll be some challenges around that from our perception, and I'm sure you may want to share some of those with us. But perhaps one final point before we ask colleagues to mention some questions to you. How will you engage with hard-to-reach groups, groups that are not usually forthcoming in these scenarios, and maybe those groups that English isn't their first language? I know we may hear that you'll use interpreters, but there may be something more than that needed. So, hard-to-reach groups, and those groups where English isn't their first language. Can you give us a response to that, please, Commissioner?
Well, we've got a really wide-reaching consultation planned. It's going to go out on all forms of social media. I'll be personally contacting every councillor, every elected member, every parish council. I'm fundamentally hopeful that where they've got a community that is seldom heard, that we're using our elected members specifically to go and garner opinion and feedback on their behalf. I think that's a fundamental. It is a challenge. I'm very interested particularly in the voice of young people in response to this. Young people are very often, well, more often actually, they're statistically far more often to be the victim of crime than those that aren't young anymore. So I'd like to hear from them. I think there's a challenge to make sure that we're into the right sort of social media. I'm told, I mean, I'm a bit late to Facebook myself, but I'm told that Facebook to some degree is a little old hat. Whether this is quite the thing for TikTok and other new means of communication, I'm not sure. My feeling is it might be actually. If we ask the right question, have we got the balance right? Do you feel heard by your police service? Particularly at the moment, there's some concern, a lack of confidence quite often from young people, even though they might not have experienced the police directly. So I think we will be provocative in our communication around that and seek to get as much input as we possibly can. I don't know at the moment whether we are expecting to publish the documents in multiple languages. That's a challenge I'm going to take from you as a result of your question. But that's something we should seriously be considering.
Yes, I declare an interest, of course, that I'm from East Staffordshire, and East Staffordshire sees a high predominance of people with English isn't their first language. Just slightly disappointed to hear you say that, Commissioner, but hopefully it'll be a positive response at some point. Thank you. Councillor Doyle, please.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Stephen Doyle, Tamworth. Looking at priority 3, just to note that your victims code needs addressing because it seems to repeat itself. But my question is that you talk about developing a more coordinated approach for witnesses support, which is currently provided by a range of agencies. So you're talking about a more coordinated approach. What changes do you foresee and what benefits will they bring? And will that, adopting an overall approach, will that make you less agile in responding to the victims? Because Staffordshire is a big area. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Doyle. A couple of things specifically in the plan I'm mentioning. The first is around a community safety forum for the whole of Staffordshire. So somewhere where we can discuss commonality, but that doesn't, and we've talked before, haven't we, about some of these issues that every community safety partnership wants to have a more consistent approach to. I think what's important is that shouldn't lose the commitment to the local community safety flavour. Every area is different. It's got different priorities, and I think it's essential that we keep our community safety partnerships based around the current districts and city model that we've got. The other commitments I'm going to make, and hopefully through that forum, if it's supported, is to talk about the locality funding, getting through to those groups sooner, giving those organisations the chance to commission services locally that suit them and with a bit more notice, and maybe commissioning on a 2 or 3 year basis rather than a short-term basis, which I think will help you address your local issues. And it's really a commitment to trying to have a shared focus on some of the stuff that's in this plan, which I don't think is a stretch, because one of those fundamentals is antisocial behaviour, and that is a priority in every one of our community safety partnerships, and it's where those partners can add the biggest value, either in their own housing interests or through their housing associations in particular, managing disputes, managing it when people are not acting in the interests of their neighbours, but also in pulling in some of those other partners where we perhaps don't stretch the capacity of the CSP, the Community Safety Partnership, enough, get the local health provision in to talk about the issues in that area. And I'm very conscious, I met with some representatives of the National Farmers Union the other day, and there's parts of this county that the issues they were bringing up would absolutely hit home, other parts where it wouldn't. So engaging with the right, in the right places with groups that have strong messages, I think is really important. But some of that I think we can discuss once. I think uni colleagues can tell the Chief Constable what you think, and we can strengthen the local delivery through that mechanism as well. I certainly hope we can.
Okay. Councillor Edgeler.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Councillor Anne Edgeler, I'm the County Councillor for the Stafford South East Division. You talked about tapping into young people and finding out what their thoughts on that are. Commissioner, have you thought about asking the school councils, I'm talking about the senior schools now, you know, about their thoughts and asking them to fill the survey in? So that's one question. And the other thing is, on page 49, you talked about vulnerable people and safeguarding and drugs. And all right, you talk about county lines. County lines have been in Stafford now, to my knowledge, for the last 30 years, you know, and it's been operating, although it seems to be a new thing, but it's not. And vulnerable people and safeguarding and drugs. My question to you is, there's so many vulnerable people out there in society that can't work for one reason or another. They've got mental health issues and that, and they're the most vulnerable in society. And yet they are getting probably disablement allowance, and then because they're so vulnerable, that is being taken over, shall we say, by the drug lords when they found out they're getting this money, and it's taken off them, and then it's ploughed back into the drug system. And I'm just wondering, Commissioner, is there anything you can do to prevent that? And I'm speaking actually from personal experience, wanting to take power of attorney over my son's affairs, and I wasn't allowed to. So that money he was getting was being ploughed back into the drug system. So I'm just wondering in your, whether you could be able to do anything about that to help other people as it's happening to now. Thank you.
Through you, Chair, just on that last one, I mean, a fundamental, you'll see again lots of references through the document to the work that the Commissioner's Office do. That prevention work in terms of supporting programmes that assist with those who are addicted to drugs or drink is absolutely core part of what we do. I think it does add value. There are difficulties around individuals' rights, especially once they reach adulthood. And sometimes you think legislation works in their favour, and sometimes you think it works against their interests. It's quite complicated. I think the key thing for me is to make sure that we're really active in that environment. We're part of the design of the solutions. We're very mindful of the value they add. It's really important, I think, just to remind people that drugs in themselves are inherently dangerous, that particularly young people aren't always aware of the risks associated with just one experience at a rave or something like that. They might think it's a recreational choice. It isn't. There's real danger in all of those pathways. Being addicted, not being able to manage your own circumstances, not being able to make good choices, makes you highly vulnerable to those who'd exploit you. And the word vulnerable here isn't just about those who might be challenged in terms of their finances or disabilities, but also those who, through their circumstances, become a target. In county lines in particular, a lot of young people find themselves involved, dragged in by these crooks. They know exactly what they're doing. Quite often bright, very capable individuals, but they've just got in the wrong world. So it's those who are targeted, and we'll talk about vulnerable in a different sense in terms of the fire plan later, but it's those who are particularly easy for those who would exploit them, and I think the service needs to keep an eye to that. Not always see them as potential offenders, but also very much victims. If I may, Chair, I mean, one of the fundamentals for this, really for me, is if at the end of my term we've got fewer victims, that would be the success of this plan. So fewer victims of crime, fewer victims of antisocial behaviour, fewer victims of road traffic accidents. That's fundamental. Let's just have fewer people having their lives blighted by the actions of others. You mentioned there the schools. There's a whole raft of people that we will be reaching out to in the consultation. It's been done before. Schools, very much part of that. I've got some engagement with the Newcastle College coming up. We're going to be doing a lot more of that in the new year, really trying to kick off a constant role engagement with young people. So yes, they'll be definitely part of the conversation.
Thank you. When we touched on the impact of drugs and drug taking, the answer to me is always in the words here that you use. We're talking about organised crime. Organised crime is a blight on so many of the topics that you've talked about, Commissioner. So until that line is broken, as it were, it'll be a big challenge on many, many fronts, together with all of the stakeholders that we've heard about or will be hearing about. Thank you. Councillor Cox.
Thank you, Chairman. Commissioner, you referred to obviously wanting to reach out as widely as possible with the consultation, which leaves me at 3.3 on our paper that you're to commence tomorrow, 26th, but you're only open for a period of 4 weeks. Is that not in itself going to reduce the possibility of getting the wider responses that you may be looking for? Because obviously if you were consulting, for example, parish councils, it may be that they're not going to have that sufficient time to respond. Sometimes they don't meet monthly, but even on a monthly basis, you're closing it before perhaps they meet by the end of November, for example. I was wondering what the rationale was behind 4 weeks, because I would consider it not long enough.
You know, I hadn't considered that it wouldn't be long enough. A month, well, a month's a long time in politics, isn't it? I think if we do this job effectively and we get it out into people's networks, we're going to get a fair response to that. Very conscious we're running up to Christmas. There's a certain amount of things that don't happen once you start encroaching into December. I'm very keen for our incoming Chief Constable to be able to take full account of this plan, and for the plan to take full account of those who are very keen to respond by the middle of December. So there is a time pressure there. Perhaps we put that on ourselves, but I would like him to be able to consider this plan in detail when he comes to do his own organisational planning. I think it's a question of us doing as effective a consultation as we can. I think 4 weeks has been the norm in the past. It's an interesting one. Bear in mind, this isn't the only consultation I'm going to do on my plan. It will be a rolling conversation. I'm looking to do surveys with the community all the time. This plan will evolve and change. So if somebody feels they've missed an opportunity, it will still remain there for revision in future years. And there's things in here that wouldn't have been in it 2 months ago, quite frankly, because the things that concern the public are changing so rapidly. So I see it as an evolving document and supplemented by conversations and surveys continually. What I would say is, as a result of my communication, hopefully around the direct email into Helen and I a couple of months ago, part of that was a heads up that the plan's coming. Please use this mechanism to let us feed back. And it means that we've already got in place all those connections through to clerks, particularly at parishes. I'm less concerned about county and district and city, because I think they will be ready to pick this up. But your point about parishes that might meet less often is well made. I hope in a month they've got time to respond and let me know. But if they don't, it doesn't mean they've missed an opportunity to steer what we do going forward.
Yeah, thanks for that. Obviously, I still air concern. You obviously alluded to schools. I mean, this week alone is half term. Head teachers probably won't be picking up anything till Sunday evening or Monday next week. I just think that it is narrowing the captures what I would consider quite an important plan, and to be sure, and I appreciate its evolving.
Thank you. I think we would echo the concerns or anxiety around the 4-week period, Commissioner. What we'd ask, I think, is once the consultation is closed, if you could let us have some details next year of the amount of people or the numbers of people that responded, and any associated breakdown with that in terms of organisations, age group, gender, if that information is available. Because we'd like to be assured that the public en bloc have had the opportunity to either respond or make any sort of representations. Thank you. Mr. Walker.
Thank you, Chair. Keith Walker, independent member. It's a very comprehensive plan, some key priorities and very important issues that have been identified. When can we expect to see the detailed plans that will help you to deliver those priorities?
I think this is a strategic document. I've deliberately not included in it the metrics for some of it, for the actual performance management of it. I believe that where there's areas where we're looking to see difference, there are key measurables in all of those areas. You will see those, and I will report on them. Really, that will be the main business of the panel to some degree, to oversee our performance monitoring, particularly around things like response times, contact performance. I've talked in the plan about the making it more obvious to people that they've got recourse to what we call an antisocial behaviour community trigger. So this is where an individual or a neighbourhood's had a number of incidences of ASB and feels they've not been addressed, that they'll be able to instigate a sort of group or partnership approach to that. I'll be making that public. Quite frankly, if the answer to that question in terms of number of incidents is 0, I'll be absolutely delighted, because that means that everything's been dealt with sooner or before somebody can press a trigger. But your suggestion around performance monitoring is absolutely key. So there's areas here, particularly in priority 1, where you will see measurable differences. In others, particularly where we're working with partnerships, it's as much about an expectation, a tone and a general direction of travel that we're looking for. And it may be on some of that we don't see results for 2 or 3 years. I'm particularly conscious that as the courts in particular are still fighting a backlog from COVID, that we might see delayed improvements. What I'd like to do is get back as quickly as possible to the throughput that we had before the pandemic, but then I'd like to push on and see as a region as getting ahead of the rest of the country and offering more rapid turnaround times in courts. But even there'll be things like the amount of guilty pleas, there'll be amount of cases that, what they call cracked cases, where a case stops and is delayed, comes back 3 or 4 times before it reaches the judge reaches the jury reaches their verdict and their sentencing. Because of the time that consumes in the court, a lot of that is down to the negotiation and discussion with offenders around pleas, some of the options for managing offences with community orders or out-of-court disposals. So there's something measurable in nearly all of this. To some degree, what is achievable is a stage of discussion and negotiation that I have now with the Chief Constable. And I'm conscious that that needs to be with Chris Noble that's coming in, around setting a clear expectation of him and the service. I don't believe in setting targets that aren't achievable. I believe in setting targets that are, and then being extremely challenging if they aren't hit. And that's what I would expect to be core business for us as a commissioner and panel in the next few months. So this is a directional document. It's an expectations document. It's mainly actually for the service to come up with the delivery plan. How are they going to make these improvements? And for me to come up with my metrics and performance model for holding them to account to it. Thank you. Supplementary.
Yeah, thank you for that. You've mentioned a number of times, and the plan is heavily dependent on partnership working. And while there are some very good examples of where partnerships have worked and they produce good results, there are probably also examples of where partnerships haven't worked. And what's the plan if in your delivery you are relying on partners to deliver and the partners don't join the party and don't deliver? What will happen then?
Well, I'll be disappointed for one. I expect the public will be too. I think part of the role of Commissioner actually is letting some partners know when they're letting people down. An awful lot of the state that still isn't directly accountable, still isn't necessarily as transparent as it might be. So, might say a few things that some people don't want to hear, some organisations don't want to hear. I'm not too concerned about that actually, because I think the relationships we've got are the right ones, and I think the ambitions are the right ones. But I've talked about criminal justice. I've also got a pretty strong sense from the public that they see there's room for improvement around some of our health relationships as well. At the service a couple of months ago, something like 40% of the calls, 999 calls, are in some way linked to mental health. I don't think the police should be essentially doing the work of mental health professionals. They can certainly work with them. They will always respond. They will always be there if somebody's in distress or it's a dangerous situation. But the counselling, the management in a safe place, that needs to be done by professionals. I'm looking forward tomorrow, actually. I've got a chat with the new chairman of the Integrated Commissioning, the ICS group, which is a new model for the NHS in the county. And there are real opportunities around mental health, ambulance, various other areas where I think we can work together more effectively. And the public is expecting us to. The public's seen what we've done with police and fire, sharing resources, sharing skills, and I think we need to see it across the whole public sector. So a real sense that organisations aren't working in silos. We try and remove silos from our own organisations. We need to be removing them from these partnership structures as well. Very encouraged by the government's push for health to be involved on violence reduction partnerships. They're very active in ours. We've got a violence reduction alliance here. That's an obligation on them now, which didn't exist before. No idea why, but it's a step in the right direction. So, yeah, it's going to be more about feeling and seeing the difference there. I'm confident we can make some progress. But as you say, perhaps a little bit more difficult to measure or be open and transparent about some of that. I might be encouraging the organisations to do their own data sharing in order that they can be measured through whatever forum they are, if not through a commissioner.
Okay, Mr. Bowen.
Thank you, Chair. Adrian Bowen, independent member. You mentioned earlier that you've got 2 new people coming into post as Chief Constable and Chief Fire Officer. So those individuals won't have been around while these plans have been developed. So I just wondered, when they are in post, in an ideal world, you want their full support of the plans as opposed to just acceptance. So I just wondered, please, what your process will be for getting their buy-in and how to deal with occasions where they may, for example, see priorities in a different order to the way you do.
That's an extremely good question. I'll offer you some reassurance that they have been involved insofar as we've discussed these plans. I've been very much in discussion about the plans with the temporary Chief Constable who you've met here, Emma Barnett. I really don't see the value in landing something in front of somebody and saying, well, here's a new set of priorities for you. The service have got a very clear idea of the things that they absolutely must address. And you'll see in the document there's a section about sort of public, local and national drivers around the plan. As I said before, this is about balancing. It's not about me saying, ignore what the National Police Chiefs Council are saying to you, ignore what the Home Secretary says to you. You've got to do this in Staffordshire. That would be highly inappropriate. What the plan is about is playing back the concerns of the community, reminding them around expectation, and making sure that that's in the forefront of their thinking in formulating their plans. So my approach has been over a number of months actually to discuss some of these ideas and suggestions, make sure that nothing is impossible, but also make sure that where there is perhaps some initial pushback, that by the time the plan arrives, they're more comfortable with what can be delivered and how to do it. And quite often I find if people have a chance to think about something, they'll find a way through it. It's the surprise and the immediate knee-jerk reaction that causes a problem. So I'm quite comfortable with where I am on that in the case of both chiefs and the organisations, actually. I think this mirrors the direction of travel and ambition in both organisations. I certainly hope so. But it also puts some pressure on where the public expectation is slightly different from the services. And there'll always be a bit of tension there. There is with every professional organisation. but that's what we want to move.
Thank you. If I may just go back to the point that, sorry, Mr. Jones. Apologies, Mr. Jones first.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Brian Jones, Deputy Leader, Cannock Chase Council. Hi, Commissioner. Just to comment on your Victims Code on page 19, my colleague from Tamworth alluded to it. It lists 12 points, but it's 4 points repeated 3 times. I don't know if that's a typo of some description, but that would be something that you'd obviously want to change. Something I was glad to hear you talk about performance indicators and measurability, and I'm particularly interested in the reduce offending and re-offending. Having looked at it, it's very individual focused, and I suppose there's an element where that can be measured. Obviously, contact and 999 calls, that's very easy to measure. What about measuring overall crime in terms of, say, crime types? Because you might wish to reduce offending and re-offending, but you might find at the end of a year or your term in office that burglary's gone up, but robbery's come down, vehicle crime's gone up, etc., and other stuff's come down. How confident are you that you can measure that, and that this plan can address those kinds of issues?
Thanks for pointing out the error. That's why this is a draft document. And I must say my team's done a fantastic job pulling this together, because we were tweaking language and words right up to the last second. So I'm not surprised there's one error in there. They've done a great job. I want fewer victims. You don't get fewer victims without reducing crime and antisocial behaviour. I'm not going to say it's a given, but crime has been falling. We've got a good track record in recent years in Staffordshire. I absolutely expect that to be the direction of travel that continues. It'll be a fundamental part of the performance review that we're looking at particular crime types. It's very interesting to see how they bounce around. I'm very confident that we've got numbers, by the way. In fact, if anything, we've got too much in the way of detail. One of the interesting things coming that we've got to try and shape into our performance agendas, if you like, particularly the public performance, is around these new national, there's half a dozen key things. One of those is neighbourhood crime, they call it, which includes burglary, robbery, car theft. Those are real indicators of what's going on in people's communities, and government's asking us to try and bundle them. There is no such measure at the moment. It's a disparate set of measures, so there's a real challenge in some of that. I think where we might end up is with a Staffordshire measure on something that over time develops into something we can compare with other places. And I understand where government's coming to. It wants to see, be able to say, compare similar places in different parts of the country. So I'm comfortable with the numbers. I'm not always comfortable with a jump to follow a trend or try and address a trend. This is an obvious example, but burglary dropped dramatically during the lockdown. It would, wouldn't it? Because people were at home. You're a bit less likely to break in, and if you were the only person walking down the street in a hoodie during that period, it stuck out a bit. So it's now beginning to climb up again. There were issues with car theft, catalytic converter theft, things like that increased during the... So quite often there are reasons for these blips, and we will comment on them, and you'll see those in our conversations with the chief. They aren't necessarily to suggest that there needs to be a change of organisational focus. I think around some of those other measurables, particularly response time, whatever the type of emergency, whether it's violence, whether it's a break-in, whether it's a robbery, it's an emergency, it's a priority, and if we are improving our response to those, if we're getting people who are very experienced in the area, getting the right people at the incident to resolve and investigate, then you'll see crime falling. And around offending and re-offending, we can actually measure the impact of that quite closely too. We were talking, Helen and I visited a site in Stoke that rehouses offenders straight out of prison for 6 months. Really impressive organisation called Restart. And I think normally re-offending rates, apologies if I get this wrong, I don't think I have, were about 40% in that cohort. If they're part of this scheme, it was 9%. Some of these individuals are responsible for an awful lot of crime. So if you tackle that, not only are you giving those people an opportunity to get back into a constructive way of life and contributing to society, but you're very much removing an awful lot of the crime stats as well. So yeah, we're keeping an eye on them. We want crime to keep going down. It almost doesn't need to be stated, but you're asking exactly the right question. If we get fewer victims, we'll have lower crime.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Commissioner, your consultation paper clearly identifies, as far as I can tell, and the committee I think the same, the majority of what your predecessors tabled 4 years ago, 8 years ago. Has any progress been made, if we look back, on your predecessors' ambitions and aspirations to address the points that you've shared with us today? And perhaps I'll ask you again, what assurances can you give the panel that in your term, 3 years, that you will be able to deliver? I think my predecessor absolutely understood some of the fundamentals, not just for Staffordshire, but what the public expect. So I would expect early intervention, prevention, dealing with offenders, working partnership, not spending any more money than we need to, understanding the difference between rural and urban. I would expect those things to stay in any plan. The plan is not just setting out what needs to change, but it's seeking the public's approval for a continuation in some key areas. I would like their endorsement of how we look after victims, how we support people who have got concerns about domestic violence. I would like them to say, yes, you need to keep the priority on in these areas. It helps us in commissioning, it helps us in the conversation with partners. However, there's some stuff in here that was not in those previous plans, and I think is significantly different. The priority around the criminal justice system is very differently framed. There is a clear expectation there of that role. You won't see it so heavily weighted in other police and crime plans around the country. I think some commissioners feel this is a very difficult area. It's actually a different department in government. The Ministry of Justice oversees this. Far less influence that they're giving commissioners than the Home Office. I think it's a fundamental area where we need to improve. There's too much concern about things like rape case numbers. There's too much concern about cases brought that break down. And there's too many cases which don't progress because witnesses don't feel well supported. And unfortunately, in some cases, victims who won't bring a case for fear or lack of support. So that's something I'm going to do something about, and that's different. Also, in priority 1, contact, response were not headline in the previous reports, plans. I think they need to be. I think there needs to be a balance between
public service element and the absolute requirements of the police service. And there is a tension there, which I've sought to present here. So that's where the difference is, really. The road safety, the involvement of volunteers, the community safety speeding work, that wasn't really high up the agenda before, and it is now. And there's some things that were there. Our predecessors were very hot in areas, I think, where Staffordshire was not as good as it needed to be, around rural crime, perhaps business crime to some degrees. And they've made great strides. I feel we're in a decent place on some of that stuff. They'll always be important, and they're now where they need to be, but they weren't originally. And some of the issues, Matthew talked about the people with mental health problems being kept in custody. Totally outrageous. And the country's in a different place as a result of that work he did, which is greatly to his credit. Doesn't need to be in here now, because that is not a priority for Staffordshire at the moment. So I'm hoping there is a bit more difference and nuance in there than you might at first have thought. But I'm not uncomfortable with some of the key messages sticking around, because they're going to stick around forever.
Okay, thank you for that. Mrs. Edgeler.
Thank you, Chairman. I introduced myself last time. I don't think I need to do it again. My question to you, Commissioner, is at a previous meeting, I asked you, and I'm talking about offending now, youth offending. I asked you about a pilot scheme taking place in Medway, about putting young people into schooling instead of putting them into a prison environment or into a young offenders institution. I wonder if you got any feedback on that, please, or whether you know anything of it. Thank you.
Councillor Edgehill, I don't know the detail of that particular programme, but I'm absolutely in support of programmes that give people opportunity to really work with experts, mentors, work with their peers, and they find a way to be better members of society. Sounds a bit cheesy, but I absolutely agree with that. I don't think it's in anybody's interest to be in prison if they don't have to be. Now, some people have to be for the safety of others, but if you're not in there for the safety of others, then the only person it's harming to some degree is yourself, and you run the risk of bumping into some pretty unsavoury characters. So where we can, those out-of-court disposals I mentioned earlier, I really do think we need to be looking at those, looking to increase those. So more community orders, more around, particularly around drugs and drink, but we've also got some good programs for people involved with domestic violence. It's about early intervention, helping people to address the situation. In some cases with some payback for the community, but let's not get them in a system where they're likely to end up with even bigger problems.
Quickie, please.
Thank you. Yeah, this Medway, this pilot scheme was brought in by the Ministry of Justice at the beginning of the year. But I fully agree with what you're saying about keeping young people out of prison. I mean, I've been sat in a court and seen a young man in the dock and begging and crying the judge not to send him to prison. And unfortunately, the judge did send him to prison. It was a very minor offence in a lot of ways. And yet that was the downward spiral, and it just escalated. And that person spent a lot of time in prison because they'd already been put in that prison system. Had they been put in another system, which you're talking about, then that might have helped in a long way. Thank you, Chairman.
Commissioner, that sounds like a matter for the judiciary, but have you anything to say in response to that point at all?
Sorry, Chairman?
Have you got any response to Mrs. Edgeler's last point, or were you just informing the Commissioner? Right, okay.
Just asking, actually, you know, if you follow that up on that Medway pilot scheme.
Okay. Mr. Lees.
Thank you very much. Commissioner, sorry, it's Councillor Roger Lees from South Staffordshire Council. I'm the leader of South Staffordshire Council. You've partially answered my one question, which is a more effective criminal justice system. How do you propose to influence it? And my second question, you've got a 4-week consultation period out now. How are you going to deal with the responses and what period of time before we put a formal document out?
We're looking to take these responses in and deal with them as quickly as we possibly can. As I said, I'm very keen for this document to be informing budget choices, but also choices around operating models, some of the decisions that the Chief Constable will want to be making in December. It'd be great if we could get this out early in the new year and it sets a tone. But those key decisions, we'll do business here, won't we, around the precept choices and things like that. I expect due regard to be given to this plan. That's the obligation on the service of the Commissioner's plan. In terms of criminal justice, as I mentioned earlier, I don't have that same degree of well, I've got influence, most definitely. We convene meetings. It's a requirement that bodies attend those meetings. We do share data. We do challenge each other. So I guess it's familiar to you as a councillor, that you're bringing parties in scrutiny meetings with an expectation that you will be taken seriously and issues are addressed. I don't have direct influence. They don't have to take due regard to my plan in the same way as the police service would. So it's a slightly different relationship. I think we've got to see where we are in a couple of years, and I will be presenting through that time areas where we perhaps expect improvement, and give you the means to monitor whether that's happening.
Right, thank you. When you say as quickly as you can, Commissioner, it's always a bit open-ended. I think we'd like to get a handle on that at some point, once you're in a position to give us a timeline for the follow-on action. And of course, we would like Mandy Pattinson to be given a heads up so that we can set any necessary meetings up for this panel to look a bit further, perhaps, if that's needed. So will you be able to do that, Commissioner, for us?
Yes, of course, Chairman. I'm imagining within a couple of weeks of the end of consultation that we'll have absorbed the responses, hopefully redrafted the document into a final form and got it into a publishable form. There's some really key conversations and choices that hang off it to some degree. It could be, if it's exactly what people think they want to see. There's a lot of what I was elected for in there in terms of a mandate. People have asked me to do some of this. So it could be that we get very few responses or a whole load of responses saying, yes, spot on. That's exactly what we were hoping for. I'm sure that won't be the case. Every organisation with a lobby will want to play up their role or just check that we've given it due consideration. So there'll be some changes to language and references, I'm sure, which is normal. What I'm hoping for is that plenty of people engage with it. Very keen to see how many people actually look at click through to see the plan. To some degree, you tend to get consultations from responses from people that aren't happy. So hopefully we'll get a few that inform us, because I'm sure there's some gaps in there.
I think that was the thinking behind my request for information about the numbers involved. That's what I was getting at. Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Chair. Looking at priority 1 and a local and responsive service, in your final paragraph you talk about encouraging more people to get involved in improving their local police service through volunteering, community representation and scrutiny and assurance work. what's the current level of volunteers and etc. that fill this gap at the moment, and how many more do you need to meet the target that you've set yourself? Or the
Councillor Doyle, I couldn't tell you how many at the moment. We discussed a bit of this around my decision about safer neighbourhood panels recently. We're doing more work already. We've got these scrutiny panels. I think there possibly be something like 30, 40 people involved with those. That's scrutiny of body-worn camera, stop and search, work, use of violence, stuff like that. We've got ETAP, which is our Ethics, Transparency, Audit Committee. I believe there's about a dozen people involved with that. We've got people helping out in custody suites. We've got people helping out to act as appropriate adults when you get young people in who find themselves in a situation where they might be charged. So there are volunteers in all sorts of spheres. We've got many dozens on Community Speedwatch. 65 groups. That's going to be a few hundred people. Now we're looking for an expansion. We've got special constables. We've got 200 on, I think, special constables. You know, there are dozens, hundreds of people already involved in helping the service, helping the partners deliver community safety. My ambition here is that we make those opportunities more open, make them more visible to people so that they can feel, yeah, I can have a go at that, I can do some of that, and get involved, and we see a general expansion. We want more people involved in dealing with issues in their own neighbourhood.
Right, thank you. Mrs. Edgeler.
Can I just mention, actually, it's just a comment really, custody visiting. I did 5 years of custody visiting, and can I tell you, if anybody's got time to do it, it really, I've come out of there in tears, I've come out there laughing my head off. It really is time, you know, it's a really good way to spend your time if you've got time to do it. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Cox.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Richard Cox, Lichfield District Council. I didn't introduce myself my first time round, but thought I should qualify that. Priority one is the local and responsive service, and we see that you recognise, as indeed you alluded to in terms of rural crime, and I recently saw something from you that I did make acknowledgement on Twitter in terms of illegal encampments, which I assume you might be referring to the travelling community. I don't see in your priorities a reference to that specific issue, but certainly, as you're well aware, Lichfield District has been certainly blighted this year, and we've in fact still got an encampment in the Street A part of the district in the city of Lichfield. Unless I've missed it, but is there obviously something that you should be perhaps putting in there? Because obviously we recognise it's collaborative work, but to our community there is an expectation that more should be done. Certainly in delivering local plans, it should be done, and I recognise that. But obviously, in terms of reaction and so forth, what would your thoughts be on that, Commissioner?
I think my thoughts, Councillor Cox, are that we're likely to have a few consultation responses saying the same thing. My awareness to this has been heightened, particularly in the last 2 weeks, but you've got to be cautious. We've discussed this at a previous meeting, haven't we? One of the things I want the forum to do county-wide is discuss how we're going to have a consistent approach. I'm not going to talk about this in the sense of travellers. The incidents that were brought to my attention the other day were threats, criminal behaviour, criminal damage, illegal trespass. It was more like organised crime on the move through the country, and it needs a different approach. I think it is something that is likely to find its way into this plan. I was just checking my introduction because I've discussed this, and I really did think I'd got it referenced in my introduction, but I don't, as it happens. But it needs to be, because it is a particular issue this month, and a particular issue to the rural community. I've made reference to environmental crime because actually that was connected in the sense that there are individuals who are collecting waste and then just disposing it up and down streets or in private driveways and avoiding the landfill costs and so on. But it's wider than that. And there is new legislation around illegal trespass, which I think we need to have a very formed up partnership view of. It's one of the things I hope to discuss with our community safety reps in the next few weeks.
Thank you. Just building on what Mr. Cox said, we have similar problems in East Staffordshire with travellers as well, and it absorbs an incredible amount of resource, both by the local authority and on occasion energising the police to come out and support if their services are needed. Okay, I think maybe, colleagues, we've concluded our debate on police. So with your agreement, we'll move on to item 8 on the agenda, the fire rescue plan, and invite the Commissioner to make a report, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've made a number of references, I think, or alluded in my previous preamble about commonalities of themes. And a number of them really apply to the fire and rescue plan as well. The keeping people safe, and particularly here reference to keeping buildings and places safe. Again, the service doesn't do this entirely on its own. I think the fundamental challenge I'm setting out in this document really is that the dangers or the challenges, the threats facing particularly the environment and keeping people safe in their houses, they're changing. Climate, we're going to hear about that for the next couple of weeks non-stop, and the impact of floods, the impact of open fires on heathland and so on. The impact of waste fires, which we've had a couple of serious ones in the county in recent years, and the threat and risk of those. These are enormous consequence to the public. They can pollute huge numbers of people. And there's a new industry around that, a lot of organised crime around waste, filling buildings with inflammable waste that needs dealing with in the fire service to stay on top of. We've got the new regulations that are rightly coming out as a result of the Grenfell tragedy, and a very high expectation that fire professionals will be involved in the planning process and protecting the public through better planning at the building approval stage. So we've got a service that's going to be asked to do some different things. They've stepped up in an incredible way during the pandemic and taken all sorts of roles alongside health partners in particular. I think we might see more of that, and I think the public would welcome it. Everybody is very, very comfortable with trained fire professionals helping, and it's fundamentally part of our approach to roads. Helen and I expect the fire service to be assisting in that collision reduction. They're very much in the sharp end when there are accidents, helping to remove people from vehicles. it's an awful thing to have to do, but they do it very well, and we would like them to do it as little as possible. So there's a whole set of things here that mean the service needs to change. It needs to be in a different place to where it's been. A lot of the terms and conditions, a lot of the working practices are actually designed for decades ago. A lot of to some degree, the model of on-call firefighters, which we rely on in some parts of the county and will continue to do so. You wouldn't design a service based around that now. People don't work within 5 minutes of the fire station anymore. They can't respond within minutes. They don't have a family background of firefighting in the way that they used to. So we've got a redesign job here. We've got an opportunity to do the right thing. There's expectations from government that the service will, in terms of preparing itself for those challenges. There will, goodness, I hope there will be fewer fires, fewer accidents, fewer needs for people to be rescued. And if there is, it will be as a result of this organisation playing its part in designing safer buildings, dealing with waste, and better able to respond. At the moment, they volunteer in the sense to respond to floods. It's not part of the mandate. But with climate change, we would like to occupy that space, I think. So this document sets out that let's get ourselves into a position where Staffordshire Fire and Rescue is ready for tomorrow. Let's get there now. Let's preempt some of the legislation that's coming. Let's consider some of the working practices now and have conversations with employee reps and others, because it's in the public interest to do so. So I hope that sets it out in a slightly different form, but you would be right if you were to challenge me to say a lot of the themes are the same, about early intervention, prevention, working in partnership, being open and transparent about the data, because that is the way that we as a Commissioners team do business. And this is a public service that's dedicated to keeping people safe in just the same way as the police are. So there's going to be commonality across the piece. Very happy to take some questions on the plan for fire and rescue.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Just before I open it up to colleagues, I think communities are more aware and more focused on the fire service now, specifically against the background that you painted for us of Grenville Tower, climate change, floods, fires, and of course we're all mindful of the jewel in the crown for Staffordshire, Cannock Chase. We'd hate to see anything awful happen there. So I think we are reasonably reassured by the objectives set out in this document. Colleagues will ask a few questions, but I think we will come back if we don't touch on the questions during the questions to have you got enough staff to deliver this? We know that the fire service, and I've mentioned this to you before, the fire service is perhaps more influenced by trade unions, certainly than the police force are. So perhaps you could capture at the end of our debate what the industrial relations are like at the moment with the fire service. Thank you. So any questions, colleagues? Mr. Lees.
Commissioner, as you know, I come from the bottom end of Staffordshire and we're very, very rural, touching on the West Midlands, and most of the stations are retained officers. What arrangements have you got for the West Midlands to react to the emergencies that the retained ones can't get to?
You call it the bottom end of Staffordshire. That's only because we keep putting our globes north upwards. It could be the top end of Staffordshire. You're right. Quite a lot of incidents are attended by 2 or more appliances. In fact, most of them. Quite often in South Staffordshire, that response from West Midlands is really fundamental. Very often the first appliance on site. They've got whole time firefighters in their stations, and they're just across the border, just down the road. As you know, we share our control centre with the West Midlands, which works very well for both areas, but particularly where we got that joint service. We have difficulty in getting the numbers of on-call firefighters that we would like, retained firefighters as you called them, in some parts of South Staffordshire and some parts of the rest of the county as well, simply because people's lifestyles are different. Now that means that sometimes the on-call response is not as readily available as we would like it. So going forward, there's always going to be a reliance and a strong relationship needed with the West Midlands. What I'm keen on, though, is that we do retain that Staffordshire delivery, that we seek to support that model where we can, and we don't just rely on our neighbours. I think if somebody was designing a service without recourse to borders, to boundaries, council boundaries, political boundaries, they might say, well, we've got cover here, got cover in Wolverhampton and the back country and so on. But it's a Staffordshire service, and I think there's a value in understanding, particularly around the prevention, the work that can be done by Staffordshire officers and those with that local knowledge in a very good working relationship with our neighbours, and we really do appreciate that. So you'll see more of the same, but in some areas where we are really struggling, I think we need to be certain of a response, and quite often the retained model doesn't always deliver that, and that's not just in South Staffs. So I hope that offers you some comfort, but you are right, because that is one of the areas of fire and rescue design, which I don't think we would do that if we were starting today.
Thank you. Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Chair. I was just looking at priority 2 and end paragraph, engage communities more in understanding the work and service and volunteering to support prevention work in activities such as Community Speedwatch. How do you see yourself or the fire service becoming more engaged with communities and publicising the work that it does? And also, as a local councillor, I'd normally invite the local PCSO to our patch clinics. Should I be doing the same sort of thing and inviting a local fire officer along as well, so that they can also promote their services as well?
Yeah, Stephen, I would like that. I think the service would welcome that as well. Not just to promote their service, but to offer where they're part of the solution to issues, and the opportunity to hear from your community group about concerns is very important. One of the things you'll see and hear about the prevention, and this has really come home during lockdown, that there was a sort of, is it called Safe and Well program, and it was pretty much a blanket thing. The service would go into an area and try and offer good advice, support with smoke alarms, things like that. It became clear through lockdown where that wasn't an option. You couldn't knock on everybody's door, even a fire and rescue guy wasn't necessarily welcome in that situation. We need to target that, and we talked about vulnerable people last time, and we need this to be targeted, because the fires are, yes, where people might have issues with addiction, but it might also be where they've got mobility problems. You know, they can't escape. Maybe it's issues where there's dementia and things are not being turned off. The most fires are related to cooking appliances still. So a little bit of a lack of attention, it matters. And a lot of those things we can tell through health indicators where we should be addressing attention. Now, it might not be for the fire service to actually fit the smoke alarm or whatever. They can talk to a relative, they can talk to a friend, neighbour, get some activity. But the activity that makes a difference is around those vulnerable dwellings. So I think for the service to be in a conversation around your local issues with that in mind will just help raise just what a part of the equation they are in keeping your residents safe. We'd really welcome that.
Thank you. Colleagues, any more questions? I'll just refer my question back to you then, if I may, Commissioner.
Chairman, it's very important that the relationship going forward is maintained at the healthy level it is now. I feel we've got a really open conversation with our, in fact there's a number of unions, but primarily the Fire Brigades Union, that's the biggest representative organisation. It's absolutely fundamental that we've got an open discussion. I've yet to have a discussion where we haven't got the interests of the public at heart. Might take a slightly different view on some of them. But the public first, making sure that we're keeping firefighters safe right there in terms of their agenda and mine, and quite rightly so. But we do need the service to be different. It's going to be asked to do different things. It might require slightly different shift patterns. It might require more flexibility. I don't think the public's really expecting a conversation about remuneration every time an opportunity comes up. But we want to protect good wages, good pensions, as we have been. I've moved very early, actually, since I took over. You know, there's been some issues around pensions. A new scheme was presented to firefighters some years ago. It's subsequently been rejected and pending as a result of legal challenge. So there's an issue called Sergeant McLeod, and what's the detriment one? Immediate detriment. Thank you, David. Immediate detriment. That meant that some people have retired on one scheme but think they're still entitled. In fact, they are entitled under a previous scheme, but it's too difficult to calculate it, so nobody's settled on that basis. Well, to my mind, that's nonsense. If somebody's retired, why wouldn't we do everything we can to make sure they get the pension they're entitled to? And if there's a bit of working out to be done down the line, then we'll do that. So I've moved quickly to resolve that, and I think that's appreciated by the retirees and also the union, and that's the basis on which I'll continue. However, there's a public expectation. We need a modern service. In some cases, it might mean fewer firefighters, but it is almost certainly going to mean more fire professionals checking the safety of buildings, assessing the safety of public spaces, working to reduce flooding. You mentioned Cannock Chase. In our national park up in the Peak District, there was a fire that burnt for months a couple of years ago on the open heath land there. So working with farmers, working with the community to prevent stuff like that. And these are real professional opportunities for fire professionals. You know, great opportunities, not just whilst they're in the service, but should they want to continue working after they've retired as well. So I think there's a real opportunity for a positive conversation there, and let's hope it continues in the way that it's currently going.
Thank you, Commissioner. Are there any more questions, colleagues? Right, thank you. Item 9 on the agenda is questions to the Commissioner by panel members. We've had a wealth of questions. Are there any more? Mrs. Edgeler.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a quick question to the Commissioner. Do fire vehicles and police vehicles carry defibrillators? If not, why not?
Sorry? David's rescued me twice in 5 minutes. David's rescued me twice in 5 minutes. Apparently our fire appliances do, most definitely. I'll find out a bit more about that for you, just to understand.
Thank you. Can I asked the question actually because I know the police vehicles in Spain, some of them do.
Chairman, if I may, one of the things I'm keen on, and it comes to partnership working on fire and police, I think there's potential for more joined up working with ambulance, paramedics, things that go to that health question. In a sense that whoever's first on site, if they've got capacity and training to save a life, then why wouldn't they? And a bit more working together, I think, is to the advantage of all the services there. So you might see some more conversations in that area.
Thank you, Mrs. Edgeler. Any more questions, colleagues? No? Right, thank you. Item 10 on the agenda then is dates of future meetings and the work programme. Pages 23 to 26 identify the way ahead. If there's no more to say today then, I'll declare this meeting closed at 3:35. Thank you, Commissioner and your team, for attendance. The meeting's now closed. Thank you.